Just a nurse. That's what they called her on her first day at Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah, and Katie Rodriguez accepted the title without flinching because flinching would have required her to care what they thought. She stood at the medication cart on the third floor, fingers steady as she pulled 0.5 milligrams of lorazepam into a syringe, while Dr. Hargrove's voice carried across the nurse's station like a blade through water. "Rodriguez, you'll observe only. Don't touch anything without asking." His eyes moved past her the way eyes move past furniture. She was already invisible. That was exactly what she wanted. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song overhead, the same song they hummed in every hospital from San Diego to here, and Katie had learned to use that white noise like a metronome for her hands. Tick. Prepare the medication. Tark. Check the order twice. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school, from 6 years of pulling tourniquets tight in sandstorms, from 3 combat deployments where the difference between a 3 milliliter syringe and a 5 milliliter syringe meant whether a Marine went home or went into a body bag. But Sacred Heart didn't need to know that. Sacred Heart needed exactly what she was giving them, a competent, quiet woman who showed up on time and asked no questions. The medication cart was stainless steel, cold under her palms, and she'd organized it the same way she organized everything, by protocol, by safety, by the principle that chaos kills people. Patients on the med-surg floor started their days at 6:51 a.m., vital signs checked by 7:15 a.m., first medications administered by 7:38 a.m. There was a rhythm to it, the same rhythm as a Humvee convoy rolling out at dawn, the same rhythm as her heart used to beat before Ramadi. Before everything. A nurse named Simone walked past carrying a stack of patient charts, nodded at Katie without really seeing her, and that was fine. Better than fine. Katie had become an expert at being forgettable. 6 months of this, 6 months since she'd left the Navy, 6 months since she'd walked away from her rank and her unit and the only life she'd ever understood, 6 months since she'd rented a studio apartment on the edge of Savannah with cash and given a fake phone number for emergency contacts. The paperwork said Katie Rodriguez, RN, with a generic employment history and no references that would lead anyone back to who she actually was. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez didn't exist anymore. She'd buried that woman somewhere between Afghanistan and the rain, and her son Derek, 17 years old, still believing his mother was deployed somewhere classified and unreachable, had no idea that she was 4 hours away in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and institutional despair. That was the weight she carried now. Not a rifle. Not a pack full of medical supplies that could stop arterial bleeding in a moving vehicle under fire. Not a unit patch sewn so carefully into the lining of her jacket that no one at Sacred Heart could see it, could touch it, could ask questions about the faded emblem of Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Just the weight of being here and not there. Being alive while the best person she'd ever known was not. The jacket hung in her locker downstairs, buried under spare scrubs and an extra pair of running shoes, and Katie had learned to check on it the way a mother checks on a sleeping child, quickly, making sure it was still there, then leaving it alone. That patch had come home from Ramadi inside her trauma shears. It had belonged to Lance Corporal Marcus Chen, who'd carried it as a good luck charm for 18 months of deployment, and Katie had sewn it into her jacket lining the night they medevaced him out on a CH-53K King Stallion with his left arm hanging on by 2 inches of muscle and tendon. He'd lived. She'd made sure of that with her hands and her training and her refusal to accept the alternative. The patch stayed with her. It was the only thing she had left that meant anything. Rodriguez. Dr. Hargrove's voice pulled her back to the present. He stood at the end of the cart, his white coat starched into submission, his grey hair styled with the kind of precision that suggested a man who believed precision was something you achieved through willpower and privilege. Behind him, 3 residents shuffled nervously, residents who were smart enough to know that Hargrove had shaped them into frightened copies of himself. Tell me the contraindications for propranolol in our patient in 312. Katie had already reviewed that chart. Patient was 83, history of asthma and COPD, current respiratory rate of 22 and climbing. Propranolol would be a mistake. A small mistake, the kind of mistake that wouldn't kill anyone by itself, but coupled with the patient's other medications and his declining renal function, it would make everything worse. She'd made a note of it during morning rounds, had planned to mention it through the proper channels, quietly, respectfully, the way a nurse was supposed to contribute to a doctor's decision-making. Asthma. COPD. Current respiratory compromise, Katie said, keeping her voice level and quiet the way she'd learned to keep it, the way you kept it in a combat hospital when the attending surgeon was twice your age and rank and believed he was the only person in the room who could think. Propranolol could trigger bronchospasm. The residents' eyes moved to Hargrove. They were waiting to see if he would acknowledge this, if he would nod and say well observed, the way the best doctors did, the way the commanding officers she'd served with had done when someone junior caught something critical. Instead, Hargrove smiled. It was the kind of smile that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Impressive, he said, and the word was a weapon. For someone with your background. So, your nursing school. Smaller program. Not one of the major universities. He picked up the chart from the cart and turned to his residents. This is why you pursue the best education available. The foundational knowledge at these lesser institutions is sometimes incomplete. He set the chart down, made a note that Katie could see was completely beside the point, and walked away without waiting for a response. The residents followed, and one of them, a young woman named Rachel with dark eyes and actual conscience, glanced back at Katie with an apology on her face. Katie was already moving to the next patient, the next medication, the next moment of being invisible. That night, her apartment was empty in the way that her body understood too well, the kind of empty that comes from choosing to be alone, from deciding that proximity to people would be a liability because people ask questions and Katie had spent her entire adult life learning not to answer them. The walls were painted a color the landlord called eggshell, and they reflected the glow of the television she didn't watch. A single lamp with a paper shade illuminated a small table where she'd set up her laptop, and on the screen was an email from Derek's school, academic probation unless his attendance improved. His mother was deployed. His father was dead. His mother had no idea he was drowning. Katie opened her laptop and closed it. Opened it again. The secure line was still registered to her old unit, still encrypted and monitored and absolutely the last thing she should touch, but the weight of not calling was heavier than the weight of calling. She had 12 years of service. 3 combat deployments. 2 Bronze Stars and a Navy Cross that were sitting in a safe deposit box in a bank she paid for electronically so no one could trace the payments. She had a 17-year-old son who'd been 7 years old the last time he'd hugged his father goodbye, and she couldn't explain why she'd chosen this apartment with walls the color of eggshell, this job where she was less than invisible, this life where being alive meant nothing because she wasn't actually living. She pressed her palm against her jacket where it hung in the bedroom closet, felt the slight bulge of the unit patch through the lining. That patrol had been 14 days before the IED. 14 days before the Humvee in front of theirs had been reduced to burning metal and the sound of young men screaming. 14 days before everything her heart understood was rewritten in smoke and blood and the absolutely specific silence that comes when your whole world has just ended and you haven't yet realized it. The rain started without warning, the way Georgia rain did, sudden and aggressive, hammering the window of her studio apartment like someone trying to get in. Katie sat on the bed that she paid for monthly, in a city where no one knew her last name was Rodriguez or what she'd done before or that she'd left a son behind who still believed she was making some kind of difference somewhere. The unit patch was against her palm now, and she pressed it harder, trying to feel through the cloth and the stitching to something real, something that mattered, something that wasn't just running away in scrubs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how easily she'd learned to exist in 2 dimensions. By day, she was just a nurse. Competent, quiet, invisible. By night, she was a woman sitting in the dark with her dead husband's memory and her living son's abandonment and a single faded patch that meant everything and nothing all at once. By day, she'd learned to absorb insults with one measured breath and a single tear that she wiped away without breaking eye contact. By night, she let herself remember that she'd been trained to kill, trained to lead, trained to make decisions that kept people alive, and she'd walked away from all of it because the person she couldn't save was the only one who'd ever mattered. The next morning, she was back at Sacred Heart, back at the medication cart, back in the white fluorescence of institutional medicine. Hargrove was already on rounds, already moving through his territory like a man who understood that hospitals belonged to doctors and nurses were just the assistants who made them look good. And Katie, moving silently beside him with her medication tray and her careful notes and her hands that had sutured wounds that would have killed anyone less trained, was ready to let him believe that. She'd learned how to hide. She'd learned it in Ramadi. She was just getting better at it with every breath. The nurse's station smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic. Katie Rodriguez was charting vitals at 11:02 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove walked past the desk, his lab coat flaring like a cape, and announced it loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm placing a wager," he said, stopping mid-stride. His voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who'd never been told no. "Rodriguez quits within 7 days. Who's taking that bet?" The room stilled. 2 residents exchanged glances. A unit clerk pretended to type. Katie kept her eyes on the screen, her hand steady on the keyboard, her breathing unchanged. 1 measured breath in. 1 measured breath out. "Come on, people," Hargrove continued, pulling a $100 bill from his wallet and setting it on the desk with theatrical precision. "She's clearly overqualified for this position. Way too nervous. The pressure will crack her by Wednesday at the latest." Katie felt the weight of his stare. The weight of every eye that refused to meet hers. She saved the chart. Closed the window. Moved to the next patient file without acknowledgement. Her hands did not shake. Her jaw did not clench. She simply existed in that moment the way she'd learned to exist in Ramadi, present, aware, utterly unreachable. "Nobody." Hargrove laughed, a sound like gravel scraping concrete. "Interesting. Well, Rodriguez, when you're gone, make sure to return your badge." He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The tension held for 3 more seconds before the unit clerk cleared her throat and the machines resumed their rhythmic beeping. Katie pulled up the next chart. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Lunch came 4 hours later. The cafeteria was crowded, that dangerous window between noon and 1 where everyone from day shift congregated around the salad bar and sandwich station. Katie carried her tray, grilled chicken, steamed broccoli, a bottle of water. She'd learned years ago that moderation was easier than apology. She was walking toward a table in the corner when Hargrove appeared from behind the beverage station. He didn't slow down. He didn't announce himself. He simply extended his right arm as he passed, and her tray flew forward. Plate, glass, silverware scattered across the tile floor in a crash loud enough to stop conversation mid-sentence. The room went silent. Katie stood motionless, staring at the floor. Broccoli scattered like spent shell casings. Chicken pieces gleaming under fluorescent lights. Water pooling across the tile in expanding rings. 30 staff members watched. No one moved to help. No one looked away. "Oops," Hargrove said from 6 feet away, not turning back, not slowing his stride. "Butterfingers." A resident snickered. Someone else, she didn't see who, smiled into their phone. Katie took 1 breath. 2 breaths. Then she knelt down and began gathering the pieces. Her movements were methodical. Her hands did not shake. She cleaned it all, every fragment, every drop, and deposited the tray in the trash. When she straightened, she saw Dr. Chen from cardiology watching her from near the coffee station. Chen's expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on something, the way Katie's hands had moved, muscle memory from a different lifetime. He turned away. Katie walked out of the cafeteria without eating. She had been spoken to worse. Much worse. In Ramadi, she'd been screamed at by commanding officers as bullets punched through plywood walls. She'd been ordered to move faster, work harder, save more. This was nothing. This was ambient noise. This was a man playing power games in a hospital where his authority was the only real weapon he possessed. But that wasn't the worst part. The afternoon rolled forward. Katie was in room for 12 with a post-op patient, reviewing his medication schedule, when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He held a patient chart against his chest like a shield, his expression already twisted with premeditated contempt. "Rodriguez, a word," he said. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway. Hargrove moved close, invading that space, establishing dominance through proximity, and spoke quietly enough that the patient couldn't hear. "I noticed you suggested a dosage adjustment to my post-op," he said. "Morphine reduction on a patient still in post-operative recovery. You realize you're not a physician, yes?" The patient's respiratory rate, Katie began, her voice steady and precise, dropped to 8 breaths per minute. "Standard protocol indicates." "Protocol?" Hargrove interrupted, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. "You're quoting protocol at me? After 6 months?" Before she could respond, he released the chart. It fell vertically, catching the air current, and landed at her feet. Pages scattered. Medical records spread across the tile like fallen leaves. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, voice syrup smooth and laced with venom. "And next time you question my clinical decisions, you come to me privately. Not in front of residents. Not in front of nursing staff. Because right now, you're just a nurse playing doctor, and frankly, the hospital is tired of it." Katie looked at the chart. Then at Hargrove. Then at the chart again. He waited, clearly expecting her to scramble. Clearly expecting tears or apologies or the kind of breaking that made him feel powerful. The hallway held its breath. 2 nurses at the medication station pretended not to listen. A resident walked faster toward the stairwell. Katie took one measured breath. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet that Hargrove had to lean in slightly to hear it. "I've been spoken to worse by better men." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, something more fragile. The realization that his words had failed to land. That she had absorbed his poison without drinking it. He straightened, his jaw tightening, and walked away without another word. Katie knelt and gathered the scattered pages, organizing them back into the folder with methodical precision. One of the nurses from the medication station made eye contact for just a moment, a flash of something like respect, before turning back to the cabinet. By 11:13 p.m., Katie was alone at Savannah Memorial Cemetery in the rain. The rain fell in thick sheets, the kind that soaked through fabric without mercy. She stood in front of a granite stone marked with a name, Michael James Rodriguez, husband, father, medic, and the rain hammered her shoulders like accusations. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words came out broken, fractured by weather and time and the weight of 6 months of silence. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I told you I'd make it right. I told you I'd build something real. And I'm hiding in a hospital in Savannah pretending to be someone I'm not. Derek doesn't even know where I am. I haven't told him anything. I'm running, and I'm making him run with me, and I don't know how to stop." The rain dripped from her face, whether rain or tears, she couldn't distinguish anymore. Her voice cracked in a way it never did in public, in a way it only did in darkness. "I failed you. I failed our son. I can't do this anymore." She stood there for 18 minutes, the rain soaking through her scrubs, the cemetery empty except for the grass and the stones and the ghosts of promises she'd made in a different lifetime. Somewhere across Savannah, a siren wailed. Somewhere in a house on Elm Street, her 17-year-old son was asleep in his bed, unaware that his mother was standing in the rain admitting defeat. Katie turned and walked back to her car, water streaming from her jacket, the faded unit patch still sewn inside the lining, the patch from her last deployment in Ramadi, the one she'd kept hidden for 3 years, the one she could never throw away. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, water dripping onto the upholstery, and waited for whatever came next. And that's when the real nightmare began. The 3-day rain had finally stopped when Colonel Mitchell walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance at 0847, his dress uniform pressed to razor edges, his bearing the kind that made civilians step aside without knowing why. Air Force. The insignia caught the morning light streaming through the atrium. He moved toward the information desk with the controlled urgency of a man accustomed to having doors open before he reached them. "I need your best doctor. Classified consultation. 20 minutes. Not a request." It was a command wrapped in courtesy, the way powerful men spoke when they'd stop bothering with please. The receptionist's fingers fumbled over the phone. The words classified and Air Force had that effect on people. She connected him to administration. Within 4 minutes, the chief of medicine himself appeared, tie hastily adjusted, greeting Colonel Mitchell like a visiting dignitary. Katie was restocking the supply cart on the 3rd floor when the overhead intercom crackled. "Dr. Hargrove to conference room B and immediate." She didn't look up. Just kept counting sterile gauze packages. 8. 9. 10. But something in the air had changed. She could feel it the way she'd learned to feel things in Ramadi, a shift in pressure, a difference in the way people moved. The nurses at the station had stopped their chatter. Their eyes had lifted toward something unfolding below. 20 minutes later, the conference room B door opened. Colonel Mitchell stepped out. Behind him came Dr. Hargrove, still speaking in that obsequious tone he reserved for people who outranked him professionally. "If you need anything else, Colonel, anything at all." Then the colonel turned. He turned at precisely the moment Katie emerged from the adjacent hallway with a fresh stand, moving to a patient room. His face went white. Not pale. White. The color of shock, of recognition, of something fundamental shifting beneath his feet. His jaw worked silently. Once. Twice. Like a man trying to form words that had no shape in his mouth. Katie felt the moment before she understood it. A prickling at the base of her skull. That particular attention that comes when eyes lock on you with the weight of knowledge. She turned. Their eyes met across 30 feet of sterile corridor. Colonel Mitchell was Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez's son's commanding officer. The man she'd pulled from a burning Humvee in Ramadi while her own hands burned through 2 layers of uniform. The man whose face she'd never expected to see again outside the context of letters she didn't open and phone calls she didn't answer. The colonel took a step forward. Katie's hand gripped the stand. One breath. Measured. Controlled. The way you held yourself when your world was realigning in real time. Rodriguez. His voice was hoarse. A question. A confirmation. A prayer. Dr. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He'd caught the name. He'd caught the colonel's reaction. And his expression shifted into something predatory. Katie said nothing. She set the stand down with deliberate care. Patient in room for 12 needs that stand, doctor. She turned to move past them both. The colonel reached out. His hand touched her shoulder, and the contact was enough to stop her, though his fingers barely pressed. "It's really you." He stopped. Swallowed hard. "Your son. Derek. He's doing exceptional work. Best tactical medic I've trained in 7 years." The hallway tilted. She did not show it. She did not show any of it. She turned back to face him with the same neutral expression she'd perfected over 6 months of humiliation. "I'm glad to hear that, sir. I need to talk to you. After. We need to." But he didn't finish. Colonel Mitchell's right hand went to his chest. His breathing stopped mid-word. His face changed from white to a shade that had no name, a color between gray and ash, the color of a body shutting down its own systems. His knees buckled. "Colonel, someone called." He was falling. His body crumpling forward like a puppet with cut strings, his uniform catching on the doorframe, his hand clutching at nothing. He hit the floor hard, his head narrowly missing the corner of the metal chair. The hallway exploded into noise. Dr. Hargrove froze. His mouth opened and closed. No words came. He stood there like a mannequin dressed in a white coat, utterly useless. Katie was already moving. She didn't run. Running was panic. She dropped to her knees beside the colonel, her hands already moving to his collar, unbuttoning his uniform jacket with the precise economy of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in worse light. The fabric gave way. His breathing was labored. Shallow. Wrong. Someone get me a crash cart. Now. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave, not louder, but heavier. Immovable. A voice that had called out grid coordinates under fire, that had ordered young Marines to hold positions when holding meant dying. The nurses scattered. She felt the colonel's chest. The ribs. The sternum. Her hands reading the body the way a musician reads an instrument. There. Right there. The pressure was wrong. The breathing shallow. The pulse already starting to race in compensation. Cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac. The heart trying to pump against the weight of its own fluid. He had maybe 7 minutes before cardiac arrest. Katie, Dr. Hargrove found his voice, thin and uncertain. We should wait for the move. Not a request. The crash cart arrived. Jenny, one of the newer nurses, had brought it. She stood frozen, staring at Katie kneeling over the Air Force colonel. Katie's hands were already prepping the site. I need a 14-gauge angiocath. Sterile field. Now. We should call cardiology, we should. Dr. Hargrove was still speaking, but his words had the quality of a man watching a train he didn't know how to stop. We don't have time for cardiology. Katie's hands moved like they'd been waiting 6 months for permission to remember who they belonged to. His pericardium is full. He needs decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She prepped the site with an alcohol swab in one smooth motion. 30 seconds to sterilize. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. No tremor. No hesitation. Just competence so complete that the nurses watching began to move in unconscious coordination with her movements, handing instruments before she asked, knowing what came next because they could read the architecture of her intention. The needle went in. She felt the layers of tissue separate, skin, muscle, the fibrous membrane of the pericardium. There. The resistance changed. Her fingers read the subtle shift the way a safecracker reads tumblers falling into alignment. The hiss of air escaping was like a prayer answered. Immediate. The change was immediate. Oxygen climbing, Jenny said, reading the monitor. 72, 78. 84. The colonel's breathing deepened. His chest rose. Actually rose, not that shallow panic gasping. 88, Jenny continued. Her voice had steadied now that the code was in motion. 92, holding stable. Katie kept her hand on the angiocath, maintaining pressure, reading the feedback through her fingertips. The fluid was draining. The pressure relief was working. The colonel's heart was beating again with room to beat, his own organ, no longer strangled by its own containment. Sinus rhythm, another nurse reported from the monitor. Relief in her voice. We've got sinus rhythm. Dr. Hargrove had backed away. He stood against the wall of the hallway, watching Katie work with the expression of a man watching a stranger wear his own face. The colonel's eyes fluttered. Conscious. Alive. The color was returning to his face, not quite normal, but the shade of a living man instead of a dying one. Katie sat back on her heels, still holding the angiocath in place. Her breathing was controlled. Utterly controlled. She could have been taking a break from restocking supplies. He needs to get to the OR, she said. Get the cardiac surgeon. Level 1 emergency. Move. The nurses moved. Dr. Hargrove was still standing against the wall. Katie looked at him. Just looked. One moment of eye contact that carried the weight of 6 months of cafeteria trays and thrown charts and pick that up, sweetheart. You going to stand there, doctor? Or are you going to help prep him for surgery? The words were quiet. But they landed like commands. Dr. Hargrove's face flushed. He pushed off from the wall and moved toward the colonel, but his movements were jerky, uncertain. The sure authority he'd wielded over Katie, over everyone, had somehow transferred in the space of a cardiac arrest. He was following orders now. His own authority suddenly conditional, provisional, depending on the competence of a nurse in scrubs who'd just saved an Air Force colonel with a needle and muscle memory forged in Ramadi. The colonel was being loaded onto the stretcher now. As they wheeled him toward the elevator, his eyes found Katie's. "Thank you," he said. His voice was still weak, but there was something in it besides gratitude. Recognition. The dawning realization that the nurse who'd just saved his life was the same woman his son had talked about in that particular way soldiers talked about people who'd held their lives in their hands. "Just doing my job, sir," Katie said. But that wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. As the elevator doors closed, trapping the colonel and the crash cart and the frenzy of emergency medicine inside that metal box, Katie became aware of the silence around her. The nurses had stopped moving. They were staring. Not at the colonel's departure. At her. At the way she'd moved. At the terminology that had slipped out like a second language she'd forgotten she spoke. At her hands, which were steady, and her voice, which had been absolutely certain, and her eyes, which had never wavered. Jenny was the first to speak. "Katie, where did you learn?" But Katie was already standing, already turning back toward the supply cart. The 4 stand. Room for 12. The patients still waiting. She walked past them all without another word, and none of them tried to stop her. Something had shifted in that hallway. Something had broken open. And every person standing there knew that they'd just witnessed something that didn't match the quiet, deferential nurse who'd started 6 months ago with no references and a lot of carefully constructed silence. The real nightmare had just begun. The silence in the ER lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitors flatlined back to their steady beep, and Dr. Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. He'd watched a nurse with 6 months on her record perform a procedure that should have taken a trauma surgeon 40 minutes. It took her 4. And Colonel Mitchell's O2 sat climbed from 68 to 94 while Hargrove stood frozen with his hands still in his pockets. The room went dead silent. Katie didn't look at anyone. She pulled the angiocath needle from the colonel's chest wall with the precision of someone who'd done this in a burning Humvee with artillery rounds walking closer every second. The hiss of the released fluid. The monitor's rhythm stabilizing into something sustainable. She peeled off her gloves and turned toward the doorway without a word, and that was when Colonel Mitchell's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His fingers were weak, all the strength was gone, but his eyes were sharp. Locked directly on hers. "Angel 6, he whispered. The words hit the room like a defibrillator paddle. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her face didn't change. She pulled her wrist free with one smooth motion and walked past him toward the sink. "Wrong patient, sir," she said quietly. And that was all. Nothing else. Just 3 words delivered in a voice that didn't belong to the nurse they'd hired 6 months ago. The colonel's eyes followed her to the doorway, then to the hallway beyond, and everyone in that trauma bay felt the temperature drop about 15 degrees. Dr. Hargrove felt it most of all. He knew what he'd just witnessed. Didn't know what it meant, but he knew it meant something enormous. And he knew that something enormous was a threat to his world. The residents whispered to each other. The attending radiologist shifted her weight. The respiratory therapist suddenly became very interested in his equipment. Everyone in that room had just watched the quiet new nurse save an Air Force colonel with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from any nursing school in Savannah. By that evening, Hargrove's phone had made 4 calls. The first went to Richard Hayes, the hospital board president who owed Hargrove a favor because Hargrove had kept quiet about Hayes's daughter's prescription drug diversion incident back in 2019. The second call went to Margaret Chen, the chief nursing officer, who'd been recommended for her position by Hargrove himself. The third went to an outside investigator named Feldman who specialized in credential fraud and background checks. The fourth was to someone Katie didn't know existed, a former colleague of Hargrove's who now worked in medical licensing verification. By 10 p.m. that night, Hargrove was sitting in his home office with a scotch in his hand and a very specific plan forming in the dark space where his conscience used to be. Katie Rodriguez had just demonstrated knowledge she shouldn't possess. Expertise she shouldn't have. And that expertise had drawn the attention of a colonel in the United States Air Force. Which meant questions were coming. Which meant investigation. Which meant Katie was about to become a liability to the hospital's reputation, to Hargrove's authority, and most importantly to Hargrove's career. So he was going to eliminate her first. The call from the investigator came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Feldman had found something interesting. Katie's employment history before Sacred Heart was spotty. References sparse. One of them, a Dr. Morrison from a small clinic in Fort Bragg, had left the medical field entirely and was now living off-grid in Montana. Another reference didn't return calls. The third one, a nurse named Patricia Sung, mentioned something odd when finally reached. Katie had used her first name and a different last name at that facility. Just for a few months. Almost like she was trying not to be found. By Wednesday afternoon, Feldman had expanded his search. No college records for Katie Rodriguez in any database. No verifiable nursing school transcripts. No licensing exam documentation that he could locate through official channels. Which was strange because she had active credentials. Current licenses. But the paper trail to get those licenses was remarkably thin. Almost invisible. Like someone had carefully constructed her identity that could survive surface-level scrutiny but would crumble under real pressure. By Thursday morning, Hargrove was sitting across from Hayes and Chen in the board conference room on the 4th floor, and he had a folder in front of him that contained documents he'd purchased from a contact who specialized in manufacturing them. The document showed that Katie had falsified her nursing credentials. That she'd stolen medical supplies, specifically controlled substances, during her time at Fort Bragg. That she had no legitimate medical background despite claiming 9 years of nursing experience. The evidence was completely fabricated. The documents were forgeries. And they were brilliant forgeries. The question, Hargrove said, his voice smooth as oil, is what she was doing here. What was she looking for? Who sent her? He leaned back in his chair. And how many other protocols has she violated since arriving at Sacred Heart? Hayes looked genuinely shaken. Chen's fingers trembled as she held the falsified credential reports. Hargrove watched their faces and felt something like victory bloom in his chest. They didn't know her. They didn't know anything about her. All they knew was what he'd just told them, and what he'd told them made her a criminal. Katie was called into the HR office at 10:43 a.m. on Friday morning. She knew what was coming the moment she saw the security guard stationed outside the door. The moment she saw Hargrove's face, that careful expression of regret, that theatrical sadness. She'd seen that face before. Not at hospitals. In military proceedings. In investigation rooms. In the moment right before someone's life got officially disassembled. Ms. Rodriguez, Hayes said, his hands folded on the desk in front of him, we've conducted a background investigation into your employment history, and we've discovered some very serious discrepancies. Katie didn't sit down. Didn't ask questions. Didn't defend herself. She simply stood there with her hands at her sides and her breathing steady, and that composure, that absolute refusal to show concern, seemed to confuse them more than any argument would have. Your nursing credentials, Chen continued, her voice uncertain, don't match our employment file. We found evidence of credential falsification. Theft of controlled substances. You've been, she paused. Looked at Hayes. You've been terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from your locker. Still, Katie said nothing. Do you understand the seriousness of these allegations? Hargrove leaned forward slightly, and his voice had that edge of genuine cruelty now. The cruelty of a man who believed he'd won. You could face criminal charges. You could lose your nursing license permanently. This is... I understand, Katie said quietly. That was all. Not a defense. Not a denial. Not an explanation. Just acknowledgement. She pulled her badge from her pocket and laid it on the desk. I'll clear my locker. The walk to the nurse's locker room felt longer than 6 months. The hallway stretched out like it was measured in years instead of feet. Katie could feel eyes on her, the medical assistant she'd worked with, the orderly she'd helped with lifting, the resident she'd quietly corrected when they were about to make mistakes. Nobody said anything. They just watched her walk past like she was already a ghost. Her locker was in the 3rd row, bottom shelf. She had almost nothing in there. A spare pair of scrubs. A picture of Derek from his high school graduation that she'd cut from a family photo because it was the only way she could keep him with her. A water bottle. Her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn so carefully into the lining that nobody would ever find it unless they were looking. She was holding that jacket when the outer door to the locker room burst open so hard it banged against the wall. Derek stood there. 17 years old. 5'10" and still growing into his father's shoulders. Breathing hard like he'd run the entire way from wherever he'd come from. And he was holding a showbox. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "I found these in the garage. I found them while I was looking for Dad's old tools," and he opened the showbox with shaking hands. "They told me at school. One of the other kids, his mom works here, she said you got fired, and I didn't believe her, and I thought maybe." He dumped the contents onto the bench beside Katie's locker. A Navy Cross. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. All of them real. All of them decades old. All of them bearing her name and the dates from Ramadi. Derek's eyes had tears running down his face. "They need to see these. They need to know who you are." Katie couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything except stare at the decorations she'd buried in a showbox in her dead husband's garage because looking at them required remembering what she'd done to earn them and what she'd lost trying not to remember. The faded unit patch in her jacket lining. The Navy Cross on the bench. Her son standing in front of her in a hospital where she'd been systematically erased over the course of 48 hours. "Come on," Derek said. His voice steadied slightly, and for a moment he sounded exactly like his father, like a man who knew something needed doing and would do it. "We're going to the administrator's office. We're going to show them. We're going to make them understand what they just did." Katie picked up the decorations. Derek picked up her jacket. And together they walked toward the main administrative hallway, and the moment they stepped through those doors, everything that Hargrove had built was going to start collapsing like a structure made of sand. Derek's hands moved like a man on a mission. He reached into the showbox and began pulling out the medals one by one, each one catching the fluorescent light as it tumbled across the desk. The Bronze Star landed first with a soft metallic clink. Then came the 2 Purple Hearts, their ribbon still vibrant. The administrator stared down at them like artifacts from another world. But Derek wasn't finished. He reached deeper and pulled out the Navy Cross, the one with the ribbon that meant someone had pulled their commanding officer from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. It landed on top of the pile. The silence in that conference room became a physical thing. Katie stood beside her son, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unchanged. This was the moment she'd spent 6 months trying to prevent. This was the moment every quiet breath, every swallowed insult, every shift she'd taken had been designed to avoid. The administrator's fingers moved toward the medals, stopped, then moved again. His hand was shaking. The board president, a woman named Eleanor Marks who'd fired Katie 48 hours earlier without hearing a single word of her defense, picked up a file folder that lay on the table. Her lips parted. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling as she spoke. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, United States Navy. 3 combat deployments. 12 commendations for valor. Eleanor looked up. Her eyes found Katie's and held there. 12. The door to the conference room opened. Colonel Mitchell stepped through in his hospital gown, the fur line still trailing from his arm, his chest still bandaged from the emergency surgery that had saved his life. He was supposed to be in ICU. He wasn't supposed to be standing. The nurses had clearly tried to stop him. He hadn't listened. The colonel moved to stand at Katie's side. When he spoke, his voice sounded like someone who'd spent 30 years commanding men in the field, who'd learned how to deliver information that mattered. Bronze Star, he said, looking at each board member in sequence. His voice didn't break. Yet. That one she earned for running medical triage under direct fire in Anbar province. Saved 43 Marines on a day nobody expected to come home. He paused. His hand moved to the first Purple Heart. 2 of these. The first was a shrapnel wound to her left shoulder from an IED we didn't see coming. The second was a gunshot graze across her ribs when she was covering a casualty evacuation. The colonel's jaw tightened. His eyes were wet now, but his voice remained level. And the Navy Cross. He lifted it from the desk with both hands like it was made of something far heavier than metal. This one. This one she earned in Ramadi when my son's convoy took a direct hit and his Humvee caught fire. 2:30 in the morning. Temperature inside the cab already over 1,000 degrees. She ran across open ground with rounds coming at her, reached into that burning metal, and pulled him out. Carried him 200 yards to cover while his uniform was still smoking. The colonel's voice finally cracked. My boy called me from Walter Reed 3 days later, and the first thing he said was, "Mom saved my life, Dad." Mom was there and she saved my life. The room had stopped breathing. Katie didn't look at the colonel. She didn't look at the medals. She looked at her son. Derek's face was wet with tears, but he wasn't looking away from his mother either. That was when Dr. Hargrove started talking. He came to his feet, his face the color of old paper, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in air. This is highly irregular. We have verification procedures. Credentials need to be authenticated. I have every right to question the legitimacy of undocumented military service claims. The hospital standards require. The FBI agent who'd been standing quietly in the corner of the room stepped forward. The gesture was small, but it was enough. Hargrove's voice died in his throat. The agent was a woman, mid-50s, with the kind of face that had seen too much to be impressed by hospital politics. Dr. Richard Hargrove, she said, we've been investigating pharmaceutical discrepancies at Sacred Heart for the last 8 weeks. Missing inventory, falsified acquisition logs, evidence pointing to substantial controlled substance diversion. She paused. What we found in the last 48 hours was considerably worse. She turned to face the board. Dr. Hargrove fabricated Katie Rodriguez's employment records. All of them. We have the original documents he altered. We also have security footage from the hospital surveillance system that shows Dr. Hargrove placing evidence, stolen medication vials, into Ms. Rodriguez's locker on Tuesday of last week at 11:43 p.m. The agent turned back to Hargrove. Her hand was moving toward her belt. We have his resignation letter dated 3 days before he claimed to have discovered the theft. We have emails to his attorney discussing how to frame a scapegoat. Hargrove's mouth opened again. No words came out. You're under arrest, the agent said. And then everything happened at once. The agent was reading him his rights in that flat, procedural voice that made it sound like the least interesting crime in the world. Hargrove was protesting, his voice climbing higher and higher, his hands pushing toward the FBI agent like that was going to stop handcuffs from closing. The board president was on her feet. Eleanor Marks was already on her phone. And Katie Rodriguez stood in the center of it all, completely still, watching the man who'd humiliated her, who'd knocked her tray to the floor, who'd thrown her chart at her feet and called her sweetheart like she was something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe, watching him realize that every strategic move, every call he'd made, every favor he'd cashed in, had been leading to this single moment. 6 months later, Derek sent his mother a photograph. The image quality was poor, clearly taken on a cell phone from across a parking lot. But it was unmistakable. Dr. Richard Hargrove in handcuffs, being escorted to a police vehicle, his face the color of his white coat. The caption read, "Savannah police arrest Dr. Hargrove on charges of prescription fraud and evidence tampering." Katie looked at the photo for approximately 3 seconds. Then she deleted it. Because that wasn't the image she wanted to carry. The one she wanted was the one Derek had taken 2 weeks earlier at the military chapel at Joint Base Charleston. Katie stood in her dress blues for the first time in 3 years. The uniform felt like returning home and leaving home simultaneously. Beside her was Colonel Mitchell, his uniform still bearing the insignia of a man who'd spent his life protecting people like the one standing next to him. Between them, in the photograph, was visible the edge of Katie's jacket. And sewn into the lining where nobody could see it unless they were looking for it, the faded unit patch from Ramadi. The one with the emblem of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The same patch her son had carried in his left breast pocket every single day since the day she'd pulled him from that burning vehicle. He'd told her, standing in the receiving line at his wedding, that he'd never taken it out once. "It kept me alive, Mom," he'd said. "Knowing you were out there. Knowing you were that close." Katie had framed that photograph. It hung in her new office at Sacred Heart. Not in the administration wing where they'd offered her a position as Chief of Trauma Services. But in the nurses' station, where anyone coming in could see it. Where any young nurse struggling with their own invisible weight could see a woman who'd carried unbearable things and still shown up. Still helped. Still gave everything to the people who needed her. The hospital had made changes. The board had implemented new oversight on medication management. They'd started a veteran support program for hospital staff. They'd created a pro bono trauma clinic in the basement, open 3 days a week, where people who'd seen combat could come and not pay a single dollar. Katie worked those clinic days without a title. She just worked. Because her fight was here now. Not in a uniform. Not in silence. But in scrubs, checking vitals, holding the hands of patients who didn't know who she really was and would probably never need to know. That was the real victory. Not the medals. Not the recognition. Not the vindication. It was this, showing up every single day for people who had no idea what they were looking at. The real heroism was invisible. It always had been. Sometimes a hero was the person at the bedside at 3 in the morning, checking me for drip, adjusting the oxygen, standing between pain and the people experiencing it. Sometimes a hero didn't have a rank. Sometimes a hero just had steady hands and a refusal to quit. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.